My name is Kevin Ladd. I am a psychologist and I teach currently at Indiana University in South Bend, Indiana. I thank you very much for this kind invitation to come and speak to the Spirit and Science World Forum. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of my thoughts and work on the topic of the psychology of prayer. In general, when I talk about the psychology of prayer, I operate from a working definition that prayer is a typically intentional attempt to establish or to maintain a sense of connectivity with the self, with the surrounding physical world, or with the perceived supraphysical world. Now, that's a very long sort of a definition, and each word and phrase in there has very particular meaning, so I'll unpack just a little bit of that. When I say that prayer is a typically intentional act that people engage in, this is primarily because sometimes people report being caught up in a spirit of prayer or the experience of prayer, even when they didn't mean to. It's something that sometimes happens spontaneously. We frequently think about prayer as more intentional, but not always. I also refer to prayer as an attempt to engage in a behavior because other people in our research have reported that while they have tried to actively pray, they feel as though their prayers, and they say, hit the ceiling, or it doesn't work at that particular moment. And I think it's very important for us to respect and to honor those experiences as well. Sometimes prayer feels like it's not doing anything. When I talk about establishing or maintaining a sense of connectivity, prayer can be a first motion toward that connection. Or prayer could also be as a result of already having a connection and wishing to extend or deepen or modify that connection. The sources and the targets of those connectivity may be myself. I may be engaging in prayer in order to better understand my own personal condition. I might also engage in prayer in order to understand and connect with somebody else or with the world around me, with nature. This I refer to as an inward or a self-oriented sort of a prayer, understanding the self, or an outward, trying to understand the world around me. And the third way in which we often think about prayer is this idea about trying to connect with a perceived supraphysical world or things beyond what are tangible. This happens in many, many different sorts of religious and spiritual traditions. This idea that there is more to the existence than meets the eye or the fingertips. With that in mind, we think about these three sorts of directions that prayer can take. This idea of the personal spiritual condition, trying to understand myself, the outward, the social spiritual condition, or the tangible, and the upward, or the divine spiritual connection. Interestingly, although those three are very nice in terms of a package for learning about prayer, inward, outward, and upward, as soon as we talk to people who are actually engaging in prayer, that structure does not necessarily match exactly what people do. Because instead of just focusing on an inward, outward, or upward sort of movement to their prayer, people instead develop themes and they mix the inward and the outward. To use a common sort of a phrase, it's not all about me. People don't usually just pray only about themselves. They don't usually pray only about the world around them, and they usually don't just pray about a supraphysical connection beyond the tangible. Instead, they mix and match these inward, outward, and upward sort of themes and bring them together in ways that are much more practically applicable for their personal conditions. For instance, they might think about internal concerns. What's going on inside myself and what's going on inside yourself? What's going on inside me and you and the divine? What is it about the nature of God that conforms to or does not my own nature or the nature of someone else? That's sort of an internal concern, mixes inward, outward, and upward sorts of directions with a particular and unique sort of a thematic. It is also possible that at some points the inward, outward, and upward get combined in such a way that people are really trying to embrace the mystery of existence. In this way, we sometimes say that people are praying according to a theme of embracing paradox. This idea that we want to know, but we don't know. The idea that we want prayer to give us answers, but we recognize that frequently those answers are not always there. That embracing the paradox of the already and not yet, the desire with the searching for the fulfillment that doesn't always happen instantaneously. And that embracing paradox can be exceptionally important as well. And then there is this other way in which prayer is not so much about the understanding or a reflective activity as it is a much more active, almost assertive or aggressive kind of a praying, really looking for things to happen and putting forth requests in a way that is very bold and dramatic. And again, this can be about requesting things of myself and holding myself to account, whether it's a matter of confession or a matter of exhortation. And that can also work with other people and even moving into the superphysical realm, trying to talk to each of these different conditions in a very bold and dramatic sort of a way. We have brought these sorts of themes and directions into the laboratory to engage in this scientific investigation to see what is common across people and what is unique to individuals. One of the ways that we have accomplished this is by the utilization of cameras. And we give people cameras so that they can go and take pictures of things that are important to them. Things that are important to them in terms of encouraging prayer, and things that are important to them in terms of discouraging or making prayer more challenging. Across thousands and thousands of these pictures, one of the things that we have been able to demonstrate is that the way people frame and look at their world is very much in keeping with the way in which they engage in prayer. And you will see here in these slides a few examples of this. For instance, the two images on the left and the right of the screen show different sorts of experiences that one might have in terms of architecture, in terms of place. One is an interior picture, the other is an exterior. And you will notice that some of them have red spots in the center. In the top row, the one on the left has a very hot spot or red spot in the center of the interior picture, and the other second row has a hot spot on the exterior picture. These two different rows were shown to two different people. And the first person had a much more inward, a much more type of concern about what was going on internally, and they focused on the interior picture. The other individual had a stronger sort of a social concern to the prayer, and they tended to focus and think that the things that were most important were the big picture items. In this way, we're able to demonstrate that the type of prayer in which someone is engaging and the way that they are viewing the world, literally, how they see things around them, is related to the way they pray. In another sort of a set of studies that we have engaged in and are continuing to engage, we utilize what are known as labyrinths. These are not mazes where you might go in and find a dead end and get lost and become frustrated. Instead, the labyrinth is what is referred to as a unicursal, or a single pathway that leads from the outside around in a convoluted path until you arrive at the center. In other words, it provides a metaphor for how it is that our life operates. We begin by entering life and we think we know where we're going, and suddenly life takes us on a very curvaceous sort of a journey until we arrive at a particular moment in time. When we utilize labyrinths with regard to prayer, we typically break this into three sort of motions that we ask people to think about. One is to think about as they walk in toward the center, think about the events in their past that have brought them to this place. When they get to the center, we ask them to just sit, to stand, to take moments to reflect on what it's like to be at that particular place at that particular time. And then as they move outward and retrace their steps along exactly the same path and move back toward that exit, we ask them to think about what might be the next steps that they will be taking in their prayer journey with themselves and with others. We are able to demonstrate then that people bring different kinds of concerns with them to this sort of an exercise. And the labyrinth, as a very particular sort of a demarcated space, gives them the moment to reflect that they might not otherwise take. It is also the case that the labyrinths come in many shapes, many sizes, many colors, and they form an attractive sort of a position in life. In other words, the labyrinth is also art at the same time that it is space, and people find themselves attracted to this art, and hence they engage in more prayer more frequently with different kinds of experiences. A third way that we have over the last 2 decades investigated what prayer is like for people is by talking to people about how it is that they use their bodies when they pray. Certainly, one use of the body is what we were just talking about in terms of their eyes and their movement, but there are also more large ways in which we use our bodies. As people pray with either hands raised or hands folded in front of them, some people might kneel or bow or engage in a whole series of activities where the body moves from up to down and down to up or side to side. We're very interested in how it is that these different motions of the body trigger different kinds of physiological reactions that may also have deep implications for the experience of prayer. As one example, if one is face down on the floor during the moment of prayer, one has created for oneself a very physiologically vulnerable sort of position. One cannot defend oneself from some sort of an exterior sort of an attack in that position because one has limited one's options in terms of mobility, in terms of vision. We find that in those sorts of moments, when people engage in prayer in that position, they tend to engage in prayers of contrition, of confession, and of great sense of openness. These sorts of themes and directionalities that occur in prayer in that particular sort of a position are very, very akin to what's going on in terms of their physiological vulnerability that translates, that is linked to, is associated with that same sort of vulnerability in terms of their spiritual content and exercise of the practice of prayer. Over the last several decades, as we've looked at many of these different sort of research studies across thousands of individuals, we come to some basic kinds of principles that we have extracted on the topic of prayer and science. One of the most important here is that quality of prayer, or the content, and the quantity, or the number of times one prays, are very distinct features. They're not the same thing. For often, people engage in very short prayers that are very, very meaningful. People might not pray at all until one particular powerful moment in which prayer occurs. And maybe it's one of those spontaneous moments when they didn't even plan to pray, but suddenly they find themselves engaged in prayer. The power of that single moment, that quality of the single moment of prayer, may be even more deep and meaningful for a person than for someone who has prayed every day of his or her life across many years. It's very important as we're asking questions of individuals who are praying, and as we ask questions of ourselves, to think critically about the nature of quality and quantity. An additional piece that we pull away from our research projects is that we need to, as leaders of spiritual development, we need to help people expect lifespan changes in their prayer. People are not going to pray in exactly the same way at all different moments in their lives. The experiences of people, early childhood into adolescence, adulthood, parenthood, into later life, our life experiences change, and yet we don't always anticipate that the ways in which we pray are going to be different. And to be open to that level of change, perhaps a change in the posture of prayer as we age or as we engage in different life experiences, perhaps a change in the walking or the movement, or an explicit dedication to ourselves to try to change the way we literally see things around us so that we might come to understand how others are seeing things. We need to expect change across the lifespan. And that is not always the case. A third principle that we pull away from this is the idea that place matters. The nature of the architecture in which we find ourselves, whether we are indoors or outdoors, whether we are out deep in nature in a forest or at a beach or in some other sort of a place, whether we're in an urban setting, in the midst of the rush of traffic, the way in which we pray changes. We don't often think about this too much once we get past and get used to attending a particular sort of a place to pray. And we don't necessarily think about moving our prayer experience into different places and seeing how that evokes different kinds of experiences. Again, in conjunction with the expectation of lifespan changes, intentionally engaging in some of these location or place changes can be very beneficial for people who are seeking to develop further their experience of prayer. A fourth principle that it comes very naturally from these studies is that senses are very, very deep influences. And we don't, again, think too much about that because we often conceive of prayer as being something that is happening in our mind. And we don't necessarily think about the aromas, about the sights, about the touches, about the tastes, about things that are going on with our sensorial experience that can also press us into different kinds of prayer awareness and experiences. So as we seek to develop additional ways of engaging prayer, these are several different opportunities that we have pulled from our scientific research that we then share with people who are seeking to develop their prayer lives in different ways. It is also the case then, in a broad sort of a sense, that we have a few musings that we bring. First, we notice that all of the scientific measurement that we can do is very fleeting. We never really capture the entirety of anybody's prayer experience. And it's very important for us as researchers to continually emphasize the intellectual humility to understand that the moments that we're capturing are not the entirety of the experience. In addition, there is a particular sort of set of movements that are somewhat concerning in terms of the commodification of prayer. That the only reason people should engage in prayer is because it promotes good health or because it promotes something else. It is important for us in many ways to go back to the theological roots about why people engage in the behavior. And in many cases within the theology, it's not to engage in prayer in order to gain something. Instead, the practice of prayer is often an intentional exercise in not gaining things, but instead of relinquishing. This is very important because if we begin to commodify prayer in the same way, for instance, that we might use some sort of a medication, take 3 aspirin, engage in 2 prayers, it actually begins to undermine the motivation and the impetus for prayer that arises. And the final piece that I will offer today is the idea that doing prayer is quite different from being prayer. This is something that we have found emerges in a small group of people. When we ask them what it is that they are doing when they pray, they respond by saying, prayer is not something that I do. Prayer is something that I am. This is a very, very interesting sort of an approach to thinking about prayer as something that takes it beyond something that is commodified, something that is a particular sort of a discipline that somebody is engaging in, to changing oneself such that prayer becomes a way of living. This is still something that is awaiting additional sort of conversation and investigation. And we hope that across your own prayer journeys or the prayer journeys of those with whom you work, that some of these overview principles and some of these musings about the nature of prayer and its relation to science might be of use to you. And we wish you well on your journey. Thank you very much for your time. Again, I'm Kevin Ladd with Indiana University South Bend, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here on the Spirit and Science World Forum.